This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time now for Part 5 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. Blood, sorrow, and silver. The growth during the early years of the first millennium BC of the use of hardened iron tools in the mining industry and the development of a highly efficient system by the Phoenicians for smelting calamine and other silver-bearing ores, as shown by the almost complete absence of silver in the slags or scoria left by their mining operations at Lorient, released a heavy flow of silver on to the bullion markets of the Near East, with the consequence that silver, further than being a standard for money accounting between merchants, and also the temples, quote, in relation to staples, other metals, and customary services, unquote, became an actual means of payment, and as currency of all levels of transaction. This practice, with all the possibilities inherent therein, towards the virtually unlimited private creation of money, in opposition to that money which had been originated as entry in the temple ledger, spread westward with all its attendant evils during the first half of the first millennium BC, as already pointed out in respect to Greece. While certain temple organizations still survived, as previously mentioned, and were strongly maintained, the instances quoted being those of the temples of Sippur and Uruk, the flood of privately issued and controlled money, which in reality was this new silver in circulation, together with the pyramid of ledger credit page entry money raised thereon, had almost completely effaced even the memory of that law in relation to exchanges. That was the word and order of the god of the city himself, and that had been the issue of kings and priesthood of former times. These kings may have been aware that the source of all their powers was the power inherent in the creation and emission of the units of exchange, which was the power to discriminate, the power to reject or prefer from amongst their subjects. And of course they may not have been so aware of the evidence revealing the steps by which this God power was undermined. The first and most important was the establishment of internal values in the exchanges within any state to the same standard as the value of silver in the international exchanges, which did not happen overnight, as it were, and may have slowly taken place over several thousand years. For at least 1,500 years before what was supposed to be the invention of coined money in Lydia, silver ingots already circulated in Babylonia, bearing the stamp of the issuing and guaranteeing authority, whether temple, state, or merchant. Before this time, quote, silver was used in many instances as a standard of value, even though it was not actually employed in payments, unquote. It is not until the Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian eras that clear evidence can be traced of the total degeneration of kingly power and of kings and so-called emperors as quite often being little more than gloriously bemedaled frontmen for private money creative power striving to create worldwide hegemony. Well, this New World Order thing goes back a long way. They still continued to be needed principally as a point towards which the eyes of the people might be diverted, in order that the people might not realize that all was not well in that direction towards which their loyalties naturally leaned, nor glimpse the destructive forces that were gnawing at the roots of the tree of life itself. Even as far back as 2500 BC, Sargon of Akkad proceeded into Anatolia to chastise the city of Ganes on account of the commercial community of Mesopotamia, probably to enforce payment of interest on loans or repayment of principal. One of the reasons of the success of Cyrus, though but a petty Persian prince, formerly to 550 BC, when he deposed his sovereign, Astyages the Mede, is clear from the circumstances of the victory over Croesus of Lydia in 546 BC. Croesus had offended international money powers, by seizure of their treasury, held by their agent Sadyates, and by the total assumption of monetary issue by the state. Example had to be made of him to deter other princes from similar action. Wow. And the eager and ambitious Cyrus was obviously the one chosen for this purpose. According to the article on Babylonia in the Encyclopedia Britannica, 9th edition, by Professor Sayce, Croesus had rashly joined battle with Cyrus without waiting for the arrival of his Babylonian allies under Nabu-Nahud, the father of Belshazzar of the book of Daniel. It is more than likely, however, that a truer reading of these events would be that international money power, patron of the rise of Cyrus, both through organization of his supplies of mercenary soldiers and of the best weapons, had been the principal influence in these events, as in other enterprises of Cyrus, such as the siege of Babylon 14 years later. Thanks to its influence, while the progress of Nabu-Nahud towards junction with the forces of Croesus would have been sabotaged, Croesus himself would have been misinformed of the intentions and strength of both Cyrus and Nabu-Nahud. Cyrus won the day, and Croesus was totally humbled. Having thus proven his quote-unquote suitability and his readiness to promote the policies of his financial backers, the relatively easy conquest of Babylon was arranged for Cyrus some 14 years later. This is such a fascinatingly different interpretation of history, and I am inclined to believe that this one is far more accurate than the ones you're going to read in mainstream ancient world history books. Cyrus, from then on, was designated, quote-unquote, the Great, and assumed the title of, quote-unquote, Great King of the vast Persian domains over which he now ruled. As the most valuable byproduct of their being and existence, kings and quote-unquote conquerors were also needed towards the maintenance of the steady inflow of slaves, sufficient to take care of the fearful death rate in the mines, and no doubt to permit of the opening of new mines due to the rapid expansion of the mining industry on account of the growth of the use of hardened iron tools and improved methods of exploration. This growth of bullion supplies, also meaning growth of the money economy, meant growth of industry. Such growth of industry meant further demand for labor, which labor then was principally slave, as money economy had not arrived at the totality of its modern development. Therefore, not only was an increasing and continuous flow of slaves needed for the mines, but also for the industry to which the products of the mines gave rise. This is starting to make sense to me why God, in the Bible, would not outlaw slavery as in bond servitude. Actually, didn't even outlaw slavery when it comes to taking prisoners of war. However, what is outlawed is men stealing. And this is what the money powers were engaged in on the coasts of the Mediterranean at that time, but and then later, many millennia later, in the 1700s, 1600s, 1800s, on the coasts of Africa, involved in men stealing. So the money powers are involved in the kind of slavery, men-stealing slavery, that the Bible does outlaw, specifically in the book of Joshua. There were two ways alone by which new supplies of precious metals became available to rejuvenate a monetary circulation, withering and even disappearing from wear and tear, exportation or hoarding, with the economic collapse that such condition could bring about. One was through mining using slave labor, as mining with free labor was rarely profitable, and the other was through sack and plunder. For the first method, quote-unquote, conquerors were needed, for free men did not willingly become mine slaves. For the second method, quote-unquote, conquerors were obviously needed again, for to cause a people to reveal and surrender their hidden hoards of precious metals would only be possible as a result of the nights of terror immediately following on the quote-unquote conquest, and the abuse and rapine infected by a lust-crazed soldiery such as followed such conquerors and achieved such quote-unquote conquests. For instance, according to the book of the Iliad, Book 9, promise of the gold and bronze plunder of Troy was the principal lure used by Agamemnon, besides the return of Briseis, to bring Achilles back into the fight. For further instance, may be accepted the main information in respect to Shalmaneser the Assyrian and his campaigns in 858 BC, leaving no doubt of the purposes of the hidden forces who guided him, and wherein lay their chief interest. The conquest of Damascus in 803 BC yielded 20 talents of gold and 2,300 talents of silver, not to speak of 300 talents copper and 5,000 talents of iron. The sack of Carchemish by Sargon, 717 BC, yielded 11 talents of gold and 2,100 talents of silver. The following table reveals what was extracted from several lesser cities and their rulers. Cities, okay, lesser cities, and the gold and silver and the annual tribute. Okay, continuing on after this chart. Tyre, Sidon, and Jehu of Israel, though clearly sitting on the fence, as it were, to secure the best advantage as might be offered out of these events, without openly committing themselves as ally of Assyria, hastened to pay tribute when after the battle near Wadi Zerzur in 842 BC, in which Hazael, usurper king of Damascus, was finally put to flight with the slaughter of some 6,000 Aramaeans, and likely the enslavement of many more. Shalmaneser, victorious but totally exhausted, came down to the coast, unable to continue with the investment of Damascus. It would be an interesting speculation as to what was really in the mind of Shalmaneser in turning towards the coast. What money power had armed Hazael to the point that he could be such a real threat to the Assyrian? Had Shalmaneser planned bloody revenge? Then, realizing that in the destruction he planned, he might further destroy his own source of arms, and those slave traders who organized the sale of his captives, had he hesitated, finally deciding to settle for tribute? The states of Arvad, Simira, and Ushana, in the fact that they paid no tribute to Nineveh, while being much closer than the Aramaean states, revealed themselves as ally. The absence of any savage thrust by Assyria at that time against Israel or Tyre or Sidon in the first phase of Assyrian conquest would suggest such states, if not actually as ally, as harboring forces in one form or another, which would be controlled by agents of that highly secret international bullion-broking fraternity, which indubitably existed, and which was connected to the extensive organization of camp followers and slave traders that must have been yet another host behind the Assyrian host, and therefore profitably enemy of the Aramaean. Money power, international in scope, being that it sought at this time to institute precious metals as the governing factor of exchanges over the rest of the known world, was deeply lodged in the heart of the Assyrian, a people to whom it had early imparted the secret Hittite skills and processes in ironworking, and who, in their homeland, had the necessary materials for such industry. Assyria, for the time, was their sword arm. Whether the Assyrians were aware of its significance or not, they must have been closely connected with that fraternity, whose business was mining of the precious metals, trade in certain staple commodities and manufactures, and slaves, and who must have conducted their operations in all the cities of Babylonia, Aram, whether enemy or not, and especially Phoenicia. Considering that Phoenician mining operations extended as far north as Britain, where was mined the tin so necessary in bronze manufacture, it may be assumed that Phoenicia, above all, dealt in Assyrian war captives. In places as distant as Cornwall, where they would have been in a relatively weak position so far from home, they would have relied on imported slaves rather than on local conquest. There is no missing the connection between the floods of slaves as released on to world markets by the Assyrian conquests, and the rapid expansions of that which is now known as quote-unquote credit, the same silver and gold mining that was taking place all over the known world at that time. Of some interest is the story of the easing of the pressure on Damascus by the departure of Shalmaneser in 839 BC during the first phase of the Assyrian conquest to more pressing business in the north. Quote, Hazael, king of Damascus, was able to turn again to Israel, unquote. Once Assyria, abandoning the Israelites, whose alliance they must have been accepting at that time, either to assure themselves of a source of supply of mercenary soldiers or of slave master camp followers, turned a deaf ear to the pleas of Jehu, the Israelite king, the Philistines, the Idumeans, the Amorites, and even their ancient ally, the Tyrians, viciously turned on them. Could it be to seize a share of the plunder gathered off the battlefields of Shalmaneser? All right, we're going to take a break, a couple of minutes. See you on the other side. Okay, we're back. Time to finish up with the second part of Part 5 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. The renewed stream of precious metal money that must have followed the sack of all those cities of Aram at this time, flowing through the coffers of the international money power located in the cities of Nineveh or Babylon or would have been accompanied by vast expansions of that which is now known as quote-unquote credit, the same being emitted in all the major cities of the Near East. Also, bills of exchange, letters of credit, but above all, the ubiquitous receipts for valuables reputedly on deposit for safe custody came into being, i.e., Clay, quote, promises to pay, unquote, i.e., all forming expansion in one form or another of the working money supply. By manipulation of such abstract monetary units in relation to what might have been described as the visible symbols of the monetary unit, such as was gold or silver money, powerful business houses combining the operations of banker, goldsmith, silversmith, etc., with branches in all major cities, were certainly able to manipulate the destinies of so-called empires, just as they have done so in this day. That Babylon itself should have been able to rise again and lead a frightened world against Assyria to form the so-called Neo-Babylonian Empire is proof, however, that international money power at that time was not monopoly of the Hebrew, who now, whatever his origins, as ally of the Israelite who had come out of Egypt, appears clearly in history a distinct entity, even if the part he plays as native of Palestine was relatively insignificant. It seems the fall of the Assyrian, in finality, in the defeat of Ashur-uballit by Nabal-Palasser in 605 BC, was also the fall of the Hebrew. No sooner had Nabal-Palasser destroyed the last remnant of Assyrian military power than, at Carchemish, his son Nebuchadnezzar destroyed that of a resurgent Egypt under Pharaoh Necho, recently victor over Josiah of Judah on that ominous place of battle, Megiddo, better known as Armageddon. See 2 Chronicles 25, 20 through 27. And where 800 years previously Thutmose III had put the Confederate armies of Syria to flight. In this battle of Carchemish, in which Pharaoh Necho had suffered complete defeat, was destroyed the last protector of Israel, and as a consequence, in 586 BC, Israel itself was totally destroyed. Its leaders, overtaken by the same fate as its Aramaean blood relatives, if not co-religionists, were... I wonder about that. Were carried off to servitude at Babylon, where in the case of some, they were used to keep the wheels of industry and finance turning in that great city, while in the case of others, they seem to have been permitted settlement in the region of the river Kebar, a large irrigation canal near Babylon, and where they were allowed to establish homes, to farm, and to maintain themselves as a racial and religious group, clearly living a national and exclusive life, as was shown by the very fact that an intensely nationalistic prophet, such as Ezekiel, could exist in the settlement at Kebar, preaching amongst his own people without restriction. During this time, the city was yet again sold to the new imperial power risen out of old Elam and the Persian highlands, and in 536 BC, the Persian forces under Cyrus the Great quietly entered the city by night march down the drying riverbed after they had completed diversion of the river. According to the book of Daniel, The proud Belshazzar, king in Babylon, was slain that night. It is interesting to note that shortly after the entry of the Persian forces into the city, the children of Israel were permitted to return to that which they considered their homeland, and every assistance was given them towards renewal of their national life and the rebuilding of their temple, which, of course, was its heart. In the very first year of his reign at Babylon, 536 BC, Cyrus issued a decree permitting the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem, and the gold and silver vessels carried away by Nebuchadnezzar, supposed to be 5,400 in number, were returned to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, who was leader of the migration. Although the proclamation of Cyrus had been addressed to all servants of God throughout the empire, the 42,000 or so who responded to the call and went with Sheshbazzar were but a small part of the Hebrew population of the total dominions of Cyrus. The special concessions made by Cyrus to the Hebrew, almost on entry into the city of Babylon, would certainly suggest that he had received their substantial assistance, perhaps through financing towards the purchase of the finest military accoutrements, such as would only be obtainable through the good graces of the Babylonian commercial and banking houses, or through that information with which the Hebrew may have kept him constantly supplied, such as the state of military preparedness within the city, etc. It may reasonably be assumed that the Babylonian money power was completely international in outlook, whatever its outward profession, and totally unsympathetic towards the ancient faith of the ziggurat and the worship of Marduk, and towards the intended effects of the restoration of the ziggurat of Ur at that time by Nebuchadnezzar. If in earlier Assyrian times such money power certainly was not the Hebrews, though possibly linked thereto through members of the latter Israelitish confederacy, such as the Habiru, or even those who derived from the Hyksos, the fact of the existence of powerful Hebrew influence in international finance in Neo-Babylonian times seems a reasonable supposition. The Hebrew, being aggressive and intelligent, may have risen to a specially privileged position in the Babylonian money industry, if that is what it can be called, and may have come to learn at that time those secret practices of the money changer's craft, which he was certainly forbidden in his native land according to the laws of Moses. In Babylonia, the law number 7 of Hammurabi has long since become a dead letter. That ungodly and cruel order of Ezra compelling the Israelites divorce their foreign wives after their return to what was considered their ancestral homeland might very well have been related to the needs of total religious, racial, and commercial security, as indeed might the ordinance existing today amongst English Quakers, forbidding them to marry outside their own sect, whose leaders, any brief study will show, were deeply involved in the growth and control of modern banking, which had led, and still leads mankind, along a road that offers little peace or rest, and finally exhaustion and calamity, a road of non-return. I didn't know that Quakers had leaders in banking. Wow. I have to look that one up. That's intriguing. One thing becomes clear out of this turmoil of rising and falling empires of the first millennium BC, particularly that calamitous succession of Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian empires, from 933 to 605 BC, 625 to 538 BC, and 538 to 332 BC, respectively, and that is this. In a world where treasure had become totally equated in the people's minds with quote-unquote wealth, as expressing relatively large sums of the monetary unit, no sooner had one power gathered all such treasure in a given area into its storehouses and safe deposits, by conquest, plunder, and sack, then such treasure, temporarily creating boom, moved on again, as likely as not to form the base of those quote-unquote credits granted by international money power towards the purchase of arms and the best of mercenary soldiers by that next power destined to arise and be the new quote-unquote conqueror. Wow, that is profound. The bankers are always behind the scenes, selling out whatever country they live in, whatever civilization, whatever world power they live in. The bankers live there, but they're international in scope, and they sell out their own country, basically, and they sell it to the next conqueror. And then they just hop, skip, and jump and go live in the next conqueror's homeland, I'm sure. And profit from it all the while. Oh my, this has gone on a long time. Dealing in money and bullion, which was the foundation of the money system, had become a highly specialized and closed trade, now able to operate quite apart from the temples, even if in many cases the temples still continued to permit themselves, and that which they stood for, to be used as front, and so had offered sanctity to those most sinister and destructive operations of the money, bullion, and slave brokers. In themselves and their attitude towards mankind, the antithesis of God, the anti-God. The money masters had only one purpose besides maintenance of secrecy, which was growth of themselves and those through whom they worked. Those through whom they worked were too often the criminal castes of the civilizations. Criminal because the nature of so much of their activities, such as fencing, counterfeiting of coinages, clipping and sweating of coins, was criminal, as it had to be. Towards this purpose, consciously or not, they sought the total destruction of that natural order of life of God, king, priesthood, and temple, and the devoted, and its eradication from the book of life itself, for piety and love and man living with hope and will for the future, guided by his trained shepherds. All of this had to be substituted for an order of the exploitation of mankind. The rulers in such an order would be its previous rejects, its outcasts. Oh my. Oh my. So this is how you get a skull and boner as president. A dropout, delinquent, secret society, Luciferian like Bush Jr. Its rejects, its outcasts. And the philandering of Clinton in a decent society. A man who can't even control his own zipper would be a reject, an outcast. And this is why we get such people over us. Oh my. Because of the money kings, the bankers behind them, which have always been here, since Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. This is profound. God, king, temple, and the devoted were to become a thing forgotten. Oh my, and man, into whom was to be injected raging animal passions, sounds like today, was to be left wandering without guide, sounds like America today, except such thrusting hither and thither by such as could only be called living sores of man-hatred. Oh, you mean like Louis Farrakhan? And Alan Dershowitz? And which were embedded in mankind itself could be called guidance. The unfortunate masses of the ancient Orient, who had so trusted their rulers, had no idea or understanding of the new reality, and that the ruler they saw, far from being the Son of God on earth, was in reality a puppet. Sound familiar? Manipulated by that conspiratorial force, sound familiar? Exerted by those controllers of precious metal bullion particularly, familiar again, that lurked in the Aramaic-speaking middle class mentioned by Professor Oppenheim. These powerful classes could have had no more than a secret contempt for the gods, kings, priesthood, and the peoples amongst whom they lived. Like Bush Jr. claiming to be a Christian when he's a Luciferian. Claiming that Islam and Christianity serve the same God, and he can't quote from the Bible. Able as they were by this manipulation to bring about the decay or growth of power without reference to such quote-unquote state power structure of those whose undoing or otherwise they planned. They themselves, through triumph of their system of private money issuance, had now in reality come to sit in the place of the gods. That sounds familiar. From this time on, it seems, there was not even that periodic interference of the king against the moneylender. Sound familiar? All of these, this is all describing America today, which gave the people respite from time to time, as in the old Babylonian period and the kingdom of Israel of record. Yeah, we're there. We're beyond that. People have no more respite from the bankers in contemporary America. Cruel private monopolization of wealth and capital grew. That sounds familiar. That sounds exactly like America. Only in America could you have a best-selling board game called what? Monopoly. With the lead piece, that little man character on the front cover of the box being J.P. Morgan in caricature. The master criminal himself. They themselves, through triumph of their system of private money issuance, had come to the place of the gods. From this time on, it seems, okay, I read that, cruel privatization, monopolization of wealth and capital grew, and where the people had been sheep in the flock, and the king their loving and devoted guide, now that kings concerned themselves with those false policies prepared for them in the interest of the private money creators. It's just like we got all of our legislation now, or so much of it, like the totalitarian takeover, the Patriot Act, which was obviously written months, if not years prior to when it was presented. It was prepared for them in the interest of the private money creators beforehand. The people became lost and disheartened, driven hither and thither, as they were by the crazed wolf masquerading in the place of the shepherd's diligent sheepdog. Wow. In this time, as today, the people were almost entirely at the mercy of the private persons controlling their money, who then controlled the inflow of precious metals, silver and gold, the foundation of the people's money. The policies of these controllers, from their standpoint as internationalists, were necessarily directed towards the stimulation of war against the well-being of mankind. Frequently, wars were, above all, the prime essential. Firstly, towards the destruction of the natural system of rule previously defined, which had been the protection of the people. Secondly, towards the re-injection into the system of hoarded coin and bullion, and consequent re-inflation of the money supply. Thirdly, but not the least important, the gathering of a new crop of slaves to replace those stocks of silver and gold so necessary to the foundation of their money power and the maintenance of their international hegemony in consequence. You've been listening to Part 5 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. You'll never find this one in your library, certainly not in audio. I am Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth. You're welcome. You're welcome for my presentation to you of this book.